My name is Matt Jenkins, and I am doing this on behalf of the Sports Administration Leadership Graduate Program. And today we'll be discussing one of the most important cases in sports law, which changed the landscaping of college athletics forever. This case is NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma. It's a landmark decision that not only reshaped how college football is broadcast, but also influenced the financial and business aspects of all college sports. We'll look at the details of the case, the legal questions it raised, and the lasting impact that it had. Now, for the case information, of course, the name is NCAA versus Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, and this was decided in the United States Supreme Court in 1984. The parties involved were the NCAA, the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, and the University of Georgia. The NCAA, as the governing body of college sports, had long controlled the television rights for college football. The Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma and the University of Georgia, along with other schools, challenged that control, arguing that it violated antitrust laws and restricted their ability to make money from broadcasting their own games. For the facts, we have to understand why this case was so significant. We need to look at the background leading up to the dispute. In the 1950s, the NCAA began controlling the television rights for college football in an effort to maintain balance in the sport. The NCAA imposed strict limits on how many games could be televised, arguing that too many televised games would dilute the sport's value and harm the overall balance between teams. The NCAA's policy aimed to limit the financial power of certain schools and ensure that the sport remained competitive. However, in the early 1980s, many universities, particularly large football programs, became increasingly frustrated with the NCAA's restrictions. These universities had big fan followings, and their athletic departments saw an opportunity to earn significantly more revenue by negotiating their own television deals outside of what the NCAA had. They argued that the NCAA's control over television broadcasting rights unfairly limited their revenue potential and, by extension, the potential financial growth of college athletics as a whole. Oklahoma and Georgia, along with other universities, sued the NCAA, claiming that its rules about the television rights violated federal antitrust laws, specifically the Sherman Antitrust Act. They argued that the NCAA's centralized control over TV broadcasts constituted an illegal restraint on trade because it limited competition and reduced the overall amount of college football televised. For the issue, the central legal issue in this case was whether the NCAA's restrictions on television rights for college football violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. The Sherman Antitrust Act prohibits business practices that unreasonably restrain trade and competition. In this case, the question was whether the NCAA's centralized control of television broadcasting rights for football amounted to such a restraint. On one hand, the NCAA argued that it had a legitimate interest in preserving the amateur nature of college sports and ensuring that no one team or conference dominated the sport's television coverage. On the other hand, the universities claimed that the NCAA's control over television broadcasts was a classic example of anti-competitive behavior, restricting their ability to freely negotiate contracts with networks and thereby stifling the competition in the market. So the legal question boiled down to whether the NCAA's actions were permissible under antitrust laws or whether they were an illegal monopoly and breaching these laws. For our rule of law, the rule of law at the heart of this case was the Sherman Antitrust Act, as I said a few minutes ago, a critical piece of U.S. legislation designed to promote fair competition. Under this law, any agreement or business practice that unreasonably restrains trade or creates a monopoly is illegal. The key provisions under this act are Section 1, which prohibits anti-competitive agreements, and Section 2, which prohibits monopolization. The NCAA argued that its actions fell within an exception to the antitrust law, claiming that the restriction on television broadcasts was necessary to preserve the integrity of college athletics and their amateur nature. The NCAA also argued that its control over TV rights was part of a larger effort to maintain a level playing field in college football. However, the plaintiffs, led by the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma, argued that the NCAA was engaged in a horizontal restraint of trade, and that occurs when competitors at the same level of a market, like different universities, agree to limit or control competition. In this case, the universities claimed that the NCAA's actions prevented them from competing with each other in a fair marketplace for TV rights. For the application, the Supreme Court applied the Sherman Antitrust Act to the facts of the case by considering the broader effects of the NCAA's television restrictions on competition. The court focused on the fact that the NCAA's control over television broadcasts effectively reduced the number of games that could be aired, limiting the ability of universities to profit from their own sports programs. In its analysis, the court determined that the NCAA's restrictions were an unreasonable restraint of trade. The court acknowledged that the NCAA had a legitimate interest in maintaining the amateur nature of college sports, but it found that the NCAA's television restrictions went too far. The court emphasized that the NCAA's actions were less about preserving competition and more about controlling the market for television contracts. The court rejected the argument that limiting the number of televised games was necessary to preserve the sport's integrity. Instead, the court found that the restrictions were more about the NCAA acting as a cartel, essentially controlling the television broadcast market in a way that eliminated competition among universities. By limiting the number of games each school could broadcast, the NCAA was essentially forcing schools to accept lower payouts and stifling the potential revenue they could earn from television contracts. The court also looked at the broader effects on consumers, specifically college football fans, of course. The court concluded that among the number of games broadcast was detrimental to fans as it reduced the availability of college football content on television. So, in conclusion, in a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Board of Regents of the University of Oklahoma and the other universities. They upheld that the NCAA's restrictions on television broadcasts violated the Sherman Antitrust Act, and the court's ruling fundamentally altered the way college sports were televised, allowing universities to negotiate their own television deals rather than being bound by NCAA imposed restrictions.